Hello and welcome to
Wednesday's Night Out.
with your host Joseph, Turnpike Plaza 365 Rec Squad.
Quotes that will change your life. Edited by Russ Kick. Reality, truth, and such things. Paranoia is having all the facts. Edmund White, paraphrasing and summarizing William S. Burroughs.
The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packard. Chapter 21. That Sunday, Kilroy decided we should cook. Too much takeout, he told me, was bad for the soul. It was a cold October day, a day he said was crying out for beef stew. We left his apartment and headed downtown, my mind for some reason racing ahead to put us in a store in the village that I'd wandered into one day. It had been crammed full of the most appealing foods I'd ever seen. Beautifully stacked fruits and vegetables, sausages hanging from the ceiling, bins of breads, shelves of exquisite cakes, trays of olives, jars of imported mustards, fresh, clean fish laid out on beds of ice, and the most incredible array of meats. Everything perfect, everything way out of my reach. How much would my share come to? Could I plead no appetite to reduce the amount of meat we bought? Baducci's, Kilroy said when he figured out what I was thinking. You don't buy stew meat at Baducci's. You mean you don't? He shook his head. I don't buy anything at Baducci's. Well, maybe a piece of imported cheese that would stink to high heaven on a day I was in a weird mood. But no one would buy stew meat there. The whole point of stew is to take a so-so piece of meat and cook the toughness out of it until it can't be anything but delicious. We went to the A&P instead, filled our cart with prepackaged stew meat, carrots, onions, mushrooms, bacon, tomato paste, beef broth, bay leaves, and a loaf of French bread. At the cash register, Kilroy waved off the money I took from my wallet. My idea, my treat. But I said, but he picked up one bag and pushed the other toward me. You're emasculate me if you fight me on this. But not if I carry one of the grocery bags. He shook his head. That's actually a notch down on my scale. Back at his apartment, we settled into his immaculate kitchen. I chopped carrots and onions on a big wooden cutting board while he browned the meat 3 or 4 pieces at a time. It was all very familiar, and after a while I realized why. in high school. Jamie and I had once checked Julia Child out of the library and made a complete French dinner for Mike and Rooster. From soup à l'oignon to tart ox pumice. It was pathetic. Now that I thought about it, Mike had proudly brought a filched bottle of horribly sweet white wine, and at the end, Rooster asked if there was ice cream for the pie. The centerpiece had been a dish nearly identical to the one Kilroy and I were working on, a beef stew with sautéed mushrooms and braised pearl onions. Hey, I said, isn't this basically broth bourguignon? Kilroy looked up from the stew pot. It would be if we were in France. Here it's just beef stew. I blushed. Oh, I see. He cooked his bread. He cocked his head. Come on, don't be like that. I just have a theory that you have to be careful about importing foreign names and pronunciations. Sometimes it's necessary, but other times it smacks of affections. I used to know this woman who'd say, "Well, I'm off to Roma next week. Would you like some buchicos?" It was tempting to throttle her. Who was she? I asked. She was a woman. You said that. He turned back to the stove and tossed some more beef into the pot. She sounds like a snooty rich girl, I said. Was she a friend of yours? What a horrible thought. The meat sizzled and spat, and he concentrated on it, turning it with a long wooden spatula. So, he turned around. She was a friend of my mother's, okay? I don't know what I could tell you about her that would make her interesting. My face burned, and I stared at the pile of chopped vegetables on the cutting board. Here we went. Say, Boff Bourguignon again, he said, something apologetic in his voice as he changed the subject. I looked up at him. Boff Bourguignon. He smiled. I was right. You do have a good accent. French for 6 years. Did you take it too? I lived there for a while, a long time ago. I set my knife down and stared. In France. His smile broadened and he nodded. I've always wanted to go to France, I exclaimed. I need a book about the House of Dior that made me want to be French. Made me want to be French for a while. For a while. How long were you there? About 2 years. My mouth fell open. I picked up a piece of carrot and set it down again, my fingers down. No need to be so impressed, he said. I'm not impressed. I'm flabbergasted. Did you live in Paris? Paris part of the time, province for a while. He shrugged. I spent a summer in the Dordogne. I can't believe this. How old were you? 27, 28. Suddenly I was confused. And this was when, 10 years ago, more actually, I felt my mouth fall open. I'm 40, he said. If that's what you want to know. 40? I'd been assuming late 20s, 30 max. At Victor and Anya's, I'd thought he was my age. The idea that he was 40 and a temp worker, 40 and living in an apartment with no more pieces of furniture than you could count on your fingers, no art on the walls, no junk. It bothered me somehow. What are you thinking? He said. I don't know. Do you mean you don't want to say? I pushed some scraps of carrot peel together, making a little pile. Okay, I said. I'm wondering why you never told me before. He raised his eyebrows. That I lived in France for a while? That you're 40? It never came up, he said with a shrug. What was I supposed to do? Fill out an application? Age, places lived. He gave me a pointed look. People known. He moved closer and put his hand behind my neck, pulling me forward until our foreheads touched. Ability to appreciate a fetching small-town girl who's full of surprises. He kissed me and his lips were warm, his stubble scratchy on the skin around my mouth. What does it matter anyway? He said, moving back toward the stew pot again. 40 doesn't say what I am. I say what 40 is. Maybe, I said, but I was reminded of what my mother'd say on the phone weeks ago about defining versus being defined by what you did, and thinking of her made me realize Kilroy was closer to my mother's age than to mine. I entered a phase of intense listening in the hope that I could learn more about him. I wanted facts. I saw myself as the perennial graduate student he'd said I should be, but a student of him, a researcher in a corral, typing notes into a laptop. I left one library only to build myself another. Yet the shelves were bare, or all they held were real books. What I learned was how much he'd like to read. He went through a book every 4 or 5 days. Huge, heavy books on the geology of the American Southwest, or Russian art and iconography, or the history of fundamentalism in the Middle East. Evenings he read while I sewed. I went back to the fabric store and bought 2 different kinds of black microfiber for a couple of pairs of side zip pants. Then took my banana to his place so I could work there. Some nights we'd go hours without talking. The only sounds my sewing machine stuttering a quick scene. Then his book answering with a flip of a page. Other nights he'd look up after half an hour and say he was thirsty. How about a beer and a game of pool at McClanahan's? He liked to read. He liked to drink beer. He liked to shoot pool. He liked to make love with me. These were the things I knew. One Saturday afternoon, he lay on his couch reading while I hand sewed the hem of the first pair of pants. At one point, I found myself thinking, I'd take up a thread from the leg side. Then I'd tunnel about a quarter-inch through the hem side, and I realized I was explaining myself to him, silently narrating the commonplace so that it could take up residence in what he knew of me. I heard a thump and looked up to see what he'd closed his book and dropped it onto the floor. He shut his eyes and stretched, his arms reaching over his head, and his stocking feet arching. Relaxing, he looked at me and said, "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The call of a bookstore. Don't you hear that little voice calling? Kilroy, Kilroy. You finished that one." He swept his hair from his forehead. "Really, we should go to the Strand so I can make some space. But I don't think they'll have what I want." "What do you mean, make some space?" He gestured at his bookcase, tall and narrow, and so crammed with books that I didn't see how it could hold another volume. "Time to thin it out. They buy used books at the Strand. Why not just get another bookcase?" That was something I thought before. He certainly had the wall space for one. He shook his head. "That's strictly forbidden." "By whom?" "Myself, of course." I gave him a look. "This is my bookcase," he said. "When it's too full, I weed out whatever's lost its glitter for me." "Why?" "Because that's what I do, Carrie. Why do you put your bins like that?" I looked down at my pincushion. Somehow or other, I'd gotten into the habit of sticking my pens into it in lines. "I'm organized," I said. "So am I." "No, you're self-denying." "Just a form of organization," he said with a smile. I glanced around his apartment, the afternoon sun slanting in to throw blocks of shadow onto his bare walls. "Is that why you don't have any family pictures around?" I said. "Any art?" His head shot around. "My God, I forgot the art." "Be serious," I said. "Wouldn't it be nice to have one picture up? One really nice picture that you really, really like?" "Think of the pressure," he said with a mild smile. "One really nice picture. I'm not man enough for that decision." He sat up, and I sighed and began putting my things away, frustrated, recently tired of the little watercolor pair hanging above my futon at the brownstone. I had taken it down and put in its place a photograph of a house in a field, taking through a deep, wet-looking mist. If Kilroy couldn't settle on one picture, why didn't he do what I did? Start his own cycle of choose and replace. Was he already at the other end of that 40 and tired, ready for some visual silence? I didn't think so. The blankness of his apartment was an avoidance, no less a one than the blankness of his past. That's a cool pincushion, actually. He was standing near me now, and I held out the pincushion for him to see. A little red silk one Mike's mother had bought for me in Chinatown one summer when they all went to San Francisco. It had a ring of tiny stuffed figures on the top of it, arms joined, each a different bright color. It's from San Francisco, I said. City of Mussels, Marinara. What? I've eaten next to nothing else there. Great place, huh? I've never been. Mike's mother bought it for me. We looked at each other for a moment. Then he entered the pincushion to me. Then he returned the pincushion to me and moved away while I put it into my sewing basket next to my orange-handled scissors and my heavy pinking shears. Were you close to her? He said. I hesitated for a moment, oddly sure he hoped for a certain answer, though I didn't know which one. I was, I said at last. We were sort of like this incredibly polite mother and daughter. She called me honey. I helped her in her garden sometimes. And then? You know. Yeah, but you and Mike were already on the outs. What did that do? What was your relationship with her just before the accident? Those last months before the accident, the slow thaw of spring, I remembered standing with her in front of their house, admiring the first purple crocuses, how she held her hands together at her throat, so pleased. But on another day, a couple weeks into May, I was sitting at their kitchen table while Mike was upstairs getting something, and she came and stood near me and asked in a low, concerned voice, "Is everything okay?" I think she was trying not to see it, I said to Kilroy, like everyone else. We headed downstairs toward the dreaded Soho. There was a bookstore on MacDougal Street that he thought would have what he wanted. A translation of a biography of Galileo. Above us, huge gray-rimmed clouds churned across the sky. I thought of how, having grown up here, he had the city in his blood. How the traffic and people and noises must feel as natural to him as their absence would have felt to me. I didn't think the commotion of New York would ever feel natural to me. Not if I lived here for the rest of my life. I hoped it wouldn't because I liked how aware of it I was. How going outside was already an event, the running of some kind of gauntlet. In the bookstore, we separated, and I wandered back to a display of big, expensive books of fashion photography. I paged through one after another, studying how one designer got from point A to point B, how another's sense of color evolved. If only I had more money, I'd try making something complicated after the pants. Maybe a suit, or I'd try combining two patterns, getting rid of the ugly sleeves on one but keeping the silhouette, changing the front opening and the front opening of another from a round neck to a V to see if I could. Money, money, money. I was running through my savings. $10 here, 20 there, 30. I'd asked my mother to find a month-by-month subletter for my apartment, and she'd gotten a law student who was paying me $100 a month beyond my rent. But that was fluff in New York subway fare. My credit card virtually glowed in my wallet, but I didn't want to start down that path. I was still the responsible citizen Jamie accused me of being. Selling my car was the obvious move. It was an Albatros, a royal pain, but it was my car, the one place in New York where I could go to feel like myself, even just for the 10 or 15 minutes it took to move it every few days. I set down the book I'd been holding and turned to another. One on the cover was a rich black and white photograph of a woman standing in front of an old stone building. A church, maybe. She wore a voluminous dark cape with the hood up, and all you could see of her was her beautiful face, secret and closed, long arched eyebrows, and a full lipped mouth. There was someone right behind me. I turned and found a woman of 45 or 50, carefully made up, with gold on her earlobes and at her throat. She wore a long tobacco brown coat over pants and a sweater of the same color. A coat for every outfit, I figured. She met my glance, then peered at the photograph. The complacence of extreme beauty. She said with a little sniff. I laughed. I was thinking she looked complicated and mysterious. She looked for her head. Oh no, she shook her head. That's what they want you to think. But she's like a Matisse, Odalisque, or something. Blissed out on self approval, she stood there with a moment for a moment, then turned around and studied her shelves behind me, where a little wooden shingle hanging into the aisles read Phi Philosophy and Religion. I turned back to the book, disappointed she hadn't said more. It was another New York moment, like at the photography show with Simon, a stranger delivering up an inscrutable, glittering sentence, pretentious, maybe, but also unforgettable, and then moving on. Maybe that's what New York would end up being to me, a collection of such moments that would accumulate into a life. I looked at the photograph again. It struck me how that the most important thing about it was not the woman but the cape, how the dark, smooth expanse of it contrasted with the rough, pale stone, and how the hood draped over her head made you think of a belle. A cape wasn't a category of garment I'd ever taken seriously. But now I thought I'd been wrong, and as I admired it, its long, fluid lines, its elegant, cursive hood, I began to reimagine it in a charcoal tweed with a soft rose lining, cashmere or merino wool. And then, suddenly, as clear as an actual voice, I imagined Jamie saying, "Yeah, if you want to look like the French lieutenant's woman," and I felt a hard tug away. All Jamie's hurt pulling me back home. I had to call her soon. A little later, I found Kilroy in the travel section, an open book in his hands. When he saw me, he flipped to a big color photograph of a street lined by towering horse chestnut trees, all abloom. "April in Paris," the caption read. "Let's go," he said. "Did you find your Galileo book?" A slow smile lifted the corners of his mouth, and he tapped the book. "To France," he said. "Let's go to France." I stared at him, his hair hanging over his forehead, his sharp, pointed nose. There was something serious in his expression, something urgent. "Okay," I said, "let's." And he nodded briskly. "Good, that settles it." He brought the Jalelo book, and then we left the store and wandered east. It was late October, and the woman I saw reminded me of the colors of hunting season, the browns and tans of the land, the brilliant dark greens of game birds. One older woman wore a paisley shawl over one shoulder, and it lay along her side like a richy color wing. I told Kilroy about the woman and the fashion photography book. She said, it like a proclamation. The complacence of extreme beauty. Then she went back to browsing in philosophy and religion. He threw back his head and laughed. That's perfect. It's probably a known pickup spot. The last place would be intellectuals trying before putting a personal's ad in the New York Review of Books. Did she have a look of advanced sexual avidity? Why the complacence of extreme beauty anyway? Why not the beauty of extreme complacence or something else entirely? It's a nice syntactical formula. Just pick two nouns and an adjective and have fun with it. The absence of identifiable intelligence, for example, he elbowed me. Come on, your turn. I shook my head. I can't think of one. The charm of excessive modesty, the perfection of complete innocence. Are you making fun of me? Absolutely not of me. The bouleversement of sudden happiness. He gave me a sweet smile and took my hand, which he'd never done before on the street, and I felt strange all at once, as if I had a long-distance crush on him, as if we were circling around each other, wondering what was going to happen. We hadn't had lunch, and a little later, somewhere on Lafayette, we stopped for soup at a tiny place I wouldn't have noticed if Kilroy hadn't pointed it out. A narrow storefront with high ceilings and ridged glass pendant lamps hanging over each booth. We sat at the counter and ate clam chowder with oyster crackers while he talked about food marriages. Solid old matches like this one. Terrible mistakes like bacon and warm potato salad. Risky onions like beef cooked in beer, which worked, and pears doused with chocolate sauce, which didn't. Chocolate sauce, he said, should be reserved for vanilla ice cream and vice versa. Then there's carrot and raisin salad, he said. One of the all-time worst things I've ever eaten. I had a spoonful of soup in my mouth, and I had to struggle to swallow it without laughing. I'd eaten dozens of carrot and raisin salads, maybe hundreds. It was one of Mrs. Mayer's signature dishes, right up there with beef stroganoff. Mike had brought a Tupperware container full to the reservoir on Memorial Day, and I could vividly see my spent paper plate sitting on the pier. A crescent of hamburger bun and a wet spot with a few carrot strips clinging to it. Beaded with mayo dressing. What? Kilroy said. Is carrot and raisin salad a big favorite out Wisconsin way? Very big. No barbecue is complete without it. He shook his head. What an abomination. He reached for his package of oyster crackers and shook a few more onto his soup. Barbecues, too. Think about it. Let's take a piece of animal flesh and set fire to it. I guess it speaks to early social man, the camaraderie of the campfire, the attempt to shut out the dark world just beyond. He gave me a grin, and I smiled. He'd spoken in what I thought of as his pseudo voice, the one he used to mimic posers and proclaimers. He was an intellectual, too, but the kind who stands outside the circle, criticizing everyone else. What he really liked was spinning theories, telling me that all New York streets were edgy, regal, or closed, that all taxi drivers were strained or loose. A few nights ago, out for a late walk, he said he'd decided that the pigeons in Washington Square lived according to an intrinsic social structure that made the giving bird you saw at a given time a function not of randomness but of secret order. You're a snob, I said now. An urban snob. Ouch. What did you barbecue a lot? Of course, I said, but that wasn't the whole story. It wasn't that I did, but that we did. We had, Mike and I. And all at once, I was back in Madison. On the night before the accident again, watching from my bedroom while Mike set our hamburgers on the hibachi on the driveway and then leaned against the old garage while they cooked. My eyes were still hot from the cry I'd had, the sobbing that had started in the kitchen while I watched him on the couch, watched him lying there as if it were the one place in the world where he truly belonged. When he heard me, he got off the couch and came right in. But after he'd held me for a while, I pulled away and took up the plate of raw burgers, passing it to him so that it was between us. The plate, forcing his attention off what had just happened and onto the idea of dinner. He took it and without a word went down the back stairs and out onto the driveway. Watching him from my bedroom window a few minutes later, I sensed something inside me breaking loose, and I felt wild. Look up, I thought. Look up. And finally he did. Looked up and stared right at me. A long, plain look. He stood with his arms at his sides, the spatula in one hand, looking and just as I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, just as I was about to wave, he switched the spatula to his left hand, raised his right hand to his forehead, and saluted. Kilroy was beside me, his spoon in midair looking at me. "What?" he said. I felt shaky. I let my spoon fall into my soup bowl with a clatter. I put my hands on my face, covering my mouth and nose, but leaving my eyes free, leaving them open so that I could see the blackboard on the other side of the corner of the counter with its specials: clam chowder, Reuben sandwich, turkey and gravy. The waiter, a dark-skinned guy about my age, sitting on a stool, reading the Post. The coffee machine, not espresso but coffee, with its brown-lipped regular pot and its orange-lipped decaf. The people behind us reflected in a band of mirror, two black-clad women in their 30s, an older man covered with paint spatters, a young guy with a ponytail talking to a gray-haired woman in a mustard brown suit. Nothing to say. New York to say, not Madison. But that's what it said. Maybe it was the pendant lamps, the double height pressed tin ceiling. Maybe it was me. "It'll be slow," Kilroy said, touching my arm. He lifted his hand and ran it down the back of my head. "It'll take as long as it takes." The Dive from Clausen's Pier by Ann Packard. Turnpike Plaza, 365, Rec Squad.